Weather you have to see to believe. Powerful storms and the people who survive them on Storm Warning. Chicago's lakefront is under siege as fierce storms blow in from Lake Michigan. It's 2 weeks before the storms finally pass, and Scott Smith, an education professor at a university in suburban Wilmette, is able to resume his lunchtime ritual.
Every day at work, I go to the beach. Unless the weather is really inclement. It's an important part of my day because it sort of recharges my batteries. And the solitude and the privacy. I'm able to contemplate how the morning has gone and plan the rest of my day.
The storms leave the lakeshore at its most rugged.
I had watched these mounds of ice be built up over the course of several winter storms, and from my personal experience, these hills were solid.
But the ice is often more fragile than it appears. Joe Falkowitz, a paramedic and ice rescue specialist with the Wilmette Fire Department, senses trouble.
People, they see ice out there, doesn't happen all the time, and they want to go out and walk on it for some reason or another.
Ice specialist Sharon Jeffers studies the movement of sea and lake ice.
What we get with winter storms in the Great Lakes is long periods of time where we have very strong onshore winds. And that's why it's very common to see this type of structure along lake shores.
These winds, often reaching 50 miles per hour or more, act like a snowplow, shoving large chunks of floating pack ice from the middle of the lake into ice ridges along the shore. As they collide, the leading edges of the ice slabs are heaved up to 20 feet into the air, while the bottom edges become anchored in the lake bed. As the ice piles up, hidden caverns are created below.
It's a tent-like structure. They can be any size. It depends on the size of the flows, it depends on the strength of the wind, and it's going to depend on the depth of the water.
In Wilmette, the heavy snow that accompanied the recent storms has filled in any gaps between the ice slabs, concealing hazardous pitfalls.
I climbed to the summit of one hill and then moved to the summit of the one that was closer to the lake. Oddly enough, as I was standing there, a little voice inside of me said, "This is sort of dangerous. Why don't you move back a little bit?" And no sooner had I turned around and started to move back than suddenly there was nothing under my feet. My first fear was drowning, and I was in my heavy winter clothes, and I knew that I would have very little chance of swimming to safety. And I saw a large cake of ice, and I pulled myself up on top of that, and it was large enough to keep me afloat.
The water temperature beneath the steep walls of the ice cave is barely above zero.
I was in such a bleak, isolated location. It was just me, the ice, and the water.
Scott is now painfully aware of several broken ribs and a crushed disc in his back.
Help! Help!
His only hope is that someone will hear his screams before he succumbs to the cold.
At one point, a violent shiver went through my whole body. I decided that hypothermia was definitely my biggest threat at that point.
An hour slowly passes. Scott no longer feels his hands and feet. His prospects of being rescued are looking grim.
I remembered from previous days there'd be no one else walking along the beach, and I knew that the odds were very long indeed that someone would hear me.
Wilmette Police Fire Emergency.
But Scott's persistence pays off. A woman walking near the lake has heard his cries for help.
Code 3, Station 26, Station 27.
Call came in, man in the water. There's a million thoughts running through your mind at that point. Is the guy under the ice? Is he out in the harbor? Is he along the shoreline? You don't know what to expect. until you actually get there and someone tells you.
What rescuer Joe Falkowitz does know is that he will be up against hypothermia, and time is critical. En route to the lake, he changes into his neoprene survival suit.
Our duty chief told me that we had a viable person that was still floating, so in that particular situation, you kick it up a notch. You know you have a real rescue instead of recovery.
Joe Falkowitz arrives and joins almost 24 other rescue personnel already on scene. Scott is drifting in and out of consciousness.
The next thing I remember was a man calling down to me and asking me if I could hold on to a lifeline if he threw it down to me. And I told him that I wasn't sure that I could.
Mr. Smith was in the water for an hour and a half. We had to get him out as quick as possible.
The next thing I really remember was a commotion. And one of the firemen who was dressed in a heavy red wetsuit.
I'm going to put a line around you. Hang on to the piece of ice a little bit. Okay.
After Joe tied the lifeline to me, I must have gone out of consciousness again because I don't remember anything else. At that stage, I had decided I was pretty much going to put my fate in the hands of the firemen.
Scott is oblivious to the arrival of Scott Ewan, Joe's cold water rescue partner. The firefighter's priority is to get a life vest around Scott to ensure he won't slip under the water and drown. Scott's body is stiffening as he fights to conserve heat by reducing blood flow to his muscles and channeling it to vital organs.
Mr. Smith had already been in there so long, and he was getting really severely hypothermic. And he couldn't move his limbs or help us. He seemed to be getting worse as time went on, and his eyes were starting to glaze over and stuff.
The firefighters finally managed to get the vest on Scott. Now the difficult part, getting him out. Firefighters working above pass a 28-foot ladder down into the cave. They must be careful not to work too close to the unstable ice surrounding the opening.
There was the hazard of being engulfed in further collapsing ice.
With the ladder secure on the lake bed, the firefighters try to carry Scott out of the cave.
We had tried to do like a fireman's carry up the ladder. So the problem with it is his body was so frozen, it didn't bend over either of our shoulders.
Being in the survival suits, you're not as coordinated to begin with, and to try to lift his weight plus the weight of all the water and everything he had on there was impossible.
The rescuers need another plan, fast. As Scott's body gets colder, his blood thickens. In response, his heart swells. Ewan knows Scott could go into cardiac arrest at any moment.
It was very close to shutting down altogether. If he would have arrested, there was really no way to do CPR or anything in the hole in a survival suit bobbing up and down in the water.
Then, they try lowering a Stokes rescue basket into the cave.
Stokes basket has buoyancy cushions along the edges. So that's floating in the water. And what we did was kind of log rolled them into the basket and tied them off. And then we proceeded to move them over to the ladder and slide them up. I was pushing from underneath, and then we had the top crew pulling from up top.
2 hours after the ordeal began, Scott Smith is finally free from the ice cave.
Sir, was there anybody else with you?
When we finally got him out, I was very pleased, but I was still worried about him.
The next thing I remember from losing consciousness after at the rescue scene was waking up in the emergency room to my wife, and waking up and looking up and seeing her face. I realized that I'd actually had made it.
I think we were all a little relieved. We knew that it was a difficult situation. You know that the training that you have done paid off, and that you were able to save someone that couldn't save themselves. So it's a very good feeling.
Joe Falkowitz and Scott Ewan received citations from the city for their bravery.
Well, I was justified in placing my fate in their hands, because they did a great job. The fact that I'm here today is testimony to their courage and professionalism.